thank you to the Emirates Center for the invitation to participate in this discussion. I will focus on the potential security risks that are posed by coronavirus. We will start with the most immediate and tactical risks, then move to the more long-term and strategic. The 6 I will discuss are not a complete list. I've chosen those that have received the least attention in the media to add to the discussion, and I look forward to comments from others adding to this list. The first risk I'd like to bring up is to address those that are already upon us. Increased cyber attack planning around the world by state and non-state actors, for example, and the looming date this October in 6 months when the UN arms embargo on Iran expires and Iran is free to upgrade its equipment and arsenals. At least 2 permanent members of the UN Security Council are likely to veto an extension of the embargo, China and Russia, which has plans to sell weapons to Iran. World leaders and diplomats are focused intently on the domestic and international coordination mechanisms needed to combat the virus. No eyes are on the embargo expiration. It is urgent that diplomats move quickly to make headway on a new arrangement. A second immediate security risk arising from COVID-19 is the drawdown of expatriate security personnel from the region. The US and other nations are sending home portions of their forces stationed in the region in order to prevent their exposure to the virus. This has an immediate impact on deterrence, as adversaries like Iran, Daesh, and like-minded extremist groups throughout the region and beyond are emboldened by the reduced presence of security forces. The IRGC increase in activity in the Arabian Sea a week ago illustrates how this drawdown for health reasons is perceived as a win for them and by them. Drawdown also has an impact on capacity building. Training missions in the Middle East are not considered essential operations for US or NATO national security, and thus are paused indefinitely in light of the virus. This prevents regional security forces from learning the skills needed to provide for their own national defense and internal security. Following the virus, the US and other militaries that provide trainers will prioritize improving their own forces' readiness and will have reduced personnel and manpower and resources to assist other countries. The absence of US and NATO forces and trainers could extend long past the cycle of the virus. Third risk to security emerging from COVID-19 is a resurgence of extremist groups and of non-state acts of terror. We know that extremist groups are gearing up to take advantage of the distracted governments of their enemies. A month ago, Daesh published an issue of its weekly newsletter, Al-Naba, that featured an editorial called Crusader's Worst Nightmare. This article encourages its followers to conduct attacks while the military and medical institutions of its enemies are overtaxed. We are already seeing this message from Daesh gaining traction among its adherents. Germany arrested people plotting an attack last week. Egypt has already experienced a new attack. A fourth risk to security resulting from the virus in the long term is the crippling of defense supply chains. To break this down a bit, each innovation in national defense relies on a supply chain that includes access to finite materials. Without access to these materials, vendors in our defense sectors can't produce and operate the things that give us a military competitive advantage. The supply chain that provides these materials is strikingly endangered by the pandemic in 2 ways. One, factories that produce necessary niche materials are shut down, causing a backup in fulfilling defensive requirements and a shortage that will be ongoing because of a lag in scaling back up once the virus is over. 2, China's economic warfare strategy benefits from this virus. The strategy involves driving small businesses that specialize in making these niche materials for our defense sectors into debt. The objective of this Chinese strategy is to monopolize critical resources like rare earth elements for their own defense and delay or prevent innovation by their adversaries. The virus puts additional economic pressure on these small businesses, forcing them to close. A fifth risk to national and international security posed by the coronavirus will emerge as the result of greater values-based research and development among world powers. For the next year or more, countries with a national identity focused on their citizens, countries like the US, the UAE, Western European nations, will redirect funding and strategic planning into preventing future pandemics. Available capital will be lower, and there will be a greater focus on sectors like healthcare and pharmaceuticals. Countries whose national identities are focused on a narrative about the greater good, countries like Iran and Russia, will ignore the needs of their populations and will direct their funding into what they hope will be leapfrog technologies. China is also in this bucket. The sixth and final risk being exacerbated by COVID-19 and posing long-term risks to international security is disinformation. China is inundating the Middle East and the rest of the world with propaganda claiming China has masterfully managed the virus and has experienced proportionally low death rates, while the US wallows in death and chaos. Members of the Chinese cabinet meet with their counterparts across the region to try and deflect blame for the global pandemic by saying the coronavirus is a bioweapon released into China by the US military. The danger here is that some decision makers believe these falsehoods, and it will lead them to make well-intended decisions that are not based on facts. These decisions could lead them to make international travel or trade policy that exposes their populations to a second wave of the virus. When that happens, we will see these 6 risks to security compounded and the effects worsened. Let's turn now to Iran. One thing we are learning is that the coronavirus, despite its power for disruption, is not swaying either the US or Iran from their stated courses of zero-sum, us-or-them regional hegemony. US policy toward Iran has not become less resolute because of the virus. This is for 2 reasons. 1, the US administration does not perceive the virus to be sufficient justification for lifting sanctions. Not only does the administration contend that Iran's imports of medical aid have never been impeded, but they point to the choice Iran can make to bring relief, which is to halt proxy and ballistic missile activity and freeze the nuclear program in place. Iran could be granted sanctions relief in the name of humanitarianism if it would disband its proxies in the name of the same humanitarianism. Most Iraqis, Lebanese, Syrians, Yemenis would definitely support this agreement, and I believe most Iranians would as well. Another reason we will not see sanctions relief is because of the recent Financial Action Task Force confirmation that Iran does not meet international standards for countering money laundering or countering terror financing. So even if sanctions on Iran were lifted, banks still could not do business with them. The second reason why US policy toward Iran has not become less resolute because of the virus is this. During the virus, Iran has continued the tempo of attacks by its proxy militias on the US presence in Iraq. The US understands this to mean that the regime in Tehran maintains a war footing despite the health crisis and therefore should be treated as such. The US has taken several attacks in Iraq in recent weeks without retaliating. But if the attacks continue, the US has made it clear that it will react, and the reaction will be retaliation for all of the militias' attacks together. It will be big. It is important to note that we are no longer in a tit-for-tat scenario. If we look at Iran's strategy with regard to its conflict with the US, are we seeing a shift due to COVID-19? While their objectives have not changed, we are seeing a shift in tactics. Take, for example, the IRGC's harassment of a tanker and US Navy ships off their coast recently. Why did they do it now? When everyone is trying to prevent escalation in Iraq? Why create a situation for escalation elsewhere? There are several reasons. One is to rally support at home when the population is angry about virus mismanagement. You may have seen this week that Iran staged a military medical parade, showcasing their mobile hospitals instead of tanks. This is because they know the population is more concerned about the virus than about military strength. Another reason Iran chose to conduct naval harassment now is to provoke potentially a low-grade US retaliatory strike and use that to rally popular support around a nationalist message. Iran also believes that this harassment supports their objective of pushing the US from the region without using their extra military forces in Iraq. Because the US has made it clear that further attacks by these militias on the US presence in Iraq will cross a red line and result in a much stronger US response. Therefore, Iran chooses to move that tit for tat, to move that potential for escalation outside of Iraq. And finally, the choice to engage in naval harassment is a way for Tehran to show that things like the supreme leader's isolation are not signs of weakness. Iran's foreign policy thus far, has not been effective. Iran has not successfully driven the US from the region. Iran has not forced President Trump to lift sanctions. Iran has not driven a wedge between the US and Europe. Iran has not installed legitimate governments deferential to them in Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. GDP in Iran has contracted by 30% since the start of the virus. That's double the impact of sanctions. But only 30% of government revenue is tied to oil. So Iran has not been hit as hard proportionally as other oil producers by the reduced demand for oil resulting from virus lockdowns, plus the Saudi-Russia oil price war. The virus impacts sectors in Iran that had not taken a large hit from sanctions. things like tourism, trade within the country, things like exports of non-petroleum products. The fact that the regime will not curtail funding to the IRGC to redirect those funds that they do have to alleviate the health crisis illustrates what a high priority the IRGC budget is. Europe will not be able to move the US towards supporting the IMF loan to Iran if Iran does not reduce its spending on proxies and missile programs. The clerical establishment and the IRGC are not going to collapse under sanctions or COVID-19. They will turn their guns on their own people before they will step aside. Hardliners in the US and Iran aren't going to meet at the table. The international community can't dictate action to Iran, but we can incentivize it and disincentivize it. European mediation is not going to work as long as Iran believes that holding out advances their objective of driving a wedge between the US and Europe. So we need a behind-the-scenes arrangement between the US and Europe that lays out commitments. For instance, if Europe pressures Iran successfully to shift funding away from proxies toward domestic needs in exchange for Europe not condemning Tehran publicly for their attacks and provocations of late, then the US will agree not to back the IMF loan. They've got to be very specific. And if the US and Iraq agree on steps together, Iran risks losing all of its friends if it holds out against such negotiation. And Iran can no longer play Europe against the US. We also need the GCC, led by the UAE and Saudi, to arrive at a mutual pact of non-aggression that creates safe skies and safe seas in the Gulf. Bilateral discussions of such agreements are already underway. They should be made public so the US can acknowledge them as steps toward de-escalation and therefore make a step toward de-escalation itself. This would begin to walk us back from where we are now, which is on the brink of war. Prior to the virus, conventional wisdom said that Tehran would wait out the US presidential election. While the regime still likes that plan, their street is focused internally and may press for their own needs before then. At that point, instead of forcing the regime to defend itself, the international community should adopt a position that allows Iran to save face and makes it look like their idea to make changes that benefit both their population and alleviate international concerns about Tehran's goals, since those two things often are in harmony. COVID-19 is giving rise to new security risks and compounding others, but it is not, unfortunately, creating the types of pressure that would reduce any. Thank you, and I really look forward to comments and conversation.